Good afternoon, everyone. We're just getting ready to begin our second session of the symposium today. So first of all, thank you for being here. For those of you who are just arriving, this symposium is called The Roots of Meaning, a symposium on Lisa Jackson's transmissions, and I want to thank all of our speakers this morning for their contributions. And we're going to start a session now called Indigenous Futurisms and the Anthropocene. This is a chance for our speakers and also I hope the audience to have a chance to engage with some of these themes as they relate to Lisa's work, Transmissions. I'd like to first introduce Dr. June Scudelaire, who is an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in First Nation Studies, also cross-appointed with the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies Department. And June has agreed kindly to moderate the session today. Unfortunately, Dr. Grace Dillon's plane was delayed, so she's not here yet. I'm very sorry, but I hope she's going to come in the door any minute. And if she doesn't, we hope that she'll be able to participate in the last session of the day. So everyone cross your fingers and your legs, and I hope that Grace will get here in time. So June, I welcome you here, and thank you very much.
Dansei Kiowa, June Scudelaire Nia Tagasan, the Chapanak Red River, Manitoba, Batoche, Saskatchewan, Egwa, Castelfranco, Veneto, Oceania. Hello, my name is June Scudelaire. I'm Métis on my mother's side, from Red River, which is now known as Winnipeg, and from Batoche, Saskatchewan, and my dad was from Castelfranco, Veneto, Italy. So I'm honored to be here on Coast Salish territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and I always ask people to reflect on what it means to be on Indigenous land. So, of course, as I tell my students, the big thing is the pipeline, which the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh are fighting against. So please support them in any way you can. So I'm excited to be moderating this panel, especially because I'm teaching a third-year class on Indigenous speculative fiction or Indigenous science futurism and horror. So my students are really interested in this subject, even though they're kind of squeamish about the horror. I'm just like, you do know it's a horror class, right? But I always include Indigenous science fiction and horror in all my classes. And I just want to say all my degrees are in English. Because I believe it's important to expand what people believe Indigenous art or fiction or gaming or VR can be. So people usually don't think Indigenous people do science fiction and horror. So in Indigenous Wonder Works and the Settler Colonial Imaginary, Cherokee scholar Daniel Heath Justice asks, if the colonial imaginary is one predicated on Indigenous deficiency and absence, an empty frontier awaiting white supremacy to give it shape and substance, then what alternative does the Indigenous imaginary offer to us as readers and as bearers of embodied story? How might a different way of engaging our histories and imagining our futures chart a different course for relationship and different possibilities for the future? Justice sees the colonial imaginary as a space similar to Terra Nullius, the empty space of what is currently called North America, where non-Christian Indigenous people weren't seen as human. The United Kingdom gained title to the lands of the American colonies at the moment of discovery by virtue of being the first civilized nation to claim the land. The sovereignty of Indigenous nations was threatened at the moment of colonization. Imagining other futures is essential for Indigenous resurgence and survivance because Indigenous peoples are still seen as being in the past, a hindrance to progress, especially when progress is in the form of pipelines and other forms of resource extraction. That's why works like Anishinaabe filmmaker Lisa Jackson's are so important. They project Indigenous people into the future, a space where we are not supposed to occupy in settler colonial societies. In this moderated conversation, speakers are invited to respond to transmissions as an expression of Indigenous futurism, a term coined by Dr. Grace Dillon, if we're just going to pretend she's sitting here right now. As a three-part installation, Transmissions evokes urban, natural, and speculative landscapes, human and non-human relationships, and the dynamic persistence of Indigenous languages and worldviews into the future. In the context of the Anthropocene, colonial extractivism, environmental degradation, and catastrophic climate change, how do Indigenous futurist works like Transmissions articulate a decolonial way forward? So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce one panelist at a time, and then they'll have approximately 5-ish minutes. I mean, they could take more time if they like. How about 10 minutes? Yeah, 10 minutes. So don't feel like you have to like stop at the 5-minute or 10-minute mark to speak. And then I have some questions, and then we're hoping the audience will have lots of questions to, oh, I see a hand waving. Oh, Dave Gardner. Okay, Dave. Okay, so that is not Dr. Grace Dillon. So I'm happy, and thanks for stepping in at the last minute. First up, we'll have Dr. Dave Gardner. No. So this is Dr. Dave Gardner, who's in UBC First Nations and Indigenous Studies, who has done a lot of work on Indigenous futurism. So thank you for stepping in. So let's give you a little while to collect yourself. You're welcome. So I'm first going to call on, oh, where are my bios? I'm going to call on Candace Collison? Yes. Yay! Dr. Candace Collison is Tahltan, an associate professor at the University of British Columbia. She is the author of How Climate Change Comes to Matter, The Communal Life of Facts, and the co-author of Reckoning, Journalism's Limits and Possibilities, which will be released in November 2019. Yay! Candace is a regular contributor to the podcast Media Indigena, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow. And then do you have slides?
I do.
Okay. Okay.
Just start with the first one and I'll tell you when I...
Okay, let's see. That's all my questions. Is that it?
I need to use this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. So, Candace Ushia, Talsadent Deni de Otsi, Chashkia Estatsai. My name is Candace. I'm Tahltan from the Crow clan. And I learned how to say this phrase when I had to give a graduation speech. So, Soga Naradich, to Kate and to Carmen for putting on this event. It's really wonderful. And also, Medu to Larry Grant and Vanessa and the panel that was this morning, and the welcomes from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Last year I was in the US as a visiting professor, and I have to say it's so wonderful to be home and to be welcomed onto traditional territory and to have good relations between institutions and the people whose territory those institutions are located on. You don't realize how much work that does for you, especially as an Indigenous scholar. To have that work done allows you to do your other work, the academic work. So yeah, that's what I'm here to talk about today. It's funny, when they asked me to participate in this, I was caught up less in futurisms and more in Anthropocene. Because that is what I've been thinking about for the last little while. I just finished writing a paper about this. Because I have been doing work on climate change since about the early mid-2000s. And I recently have been asked very interesting questions. So when I first started doing research, Indigenous knowledge was new. It was hot. It was a buzzword. My concerns were around whether or not it was all rhetoric or how it was being integrated. And thankfully there's been lots of scholarship on that over the last 20 years. But it's interesting now as the climate change conversations, and I note that today is the first day of the climate change strikes, so here we are talking about it. You are participating in some way by thinking with me on this. As the climate change conversation has moved, and you may not be aware of this, but right now the conversations are around global climate services. So I've been involved with historians and scientists talking about this. And one of the questions I got at a recent workshop that I was at was, what's the use of Indigenous knowledge? Right, which is an interesting question. So you might be tempted to be offended, and it is a bit offensive. And at the same time, it really, perhaps more than many questions I've been asked, reveals the ways in which science kind of prefigures so much of the terrain when we talk about environment. And so as I've been writing about Anthropocene, I've been building on work by Zoe Todd and Heather Davis, who wrote a great essay about it. I've been building on work by Kyle Powys-White as well, and many people like Grace Dillon who've been working on futurisms as a concept, as something that moves us forward. And the Anthropocene is really interesting, right? Because it's not just a conversation about the future, it's really a conversation about the past and how we think about how deep that past is and what the levers for change have been. And so if you've been paying attention to the science literature, you may have also noticed that there was some new scientific studies that came out earlier this year that talked about how 56 million Indigenous people were killed, and we now have evidence of that in geological records. And it was very interesting to me because, and you can go to the next slide, because when CNN reported on it, they reported on it as a science story, right? So we now have evidence that shows us that, genocide was real, that it really happened, and it became really a science story, right? Except when you saw it in the hands of Indigenous journalists. And you can go to the next slide. This is a story by Mark Trahant, who's the current editor for Indian Country Today. And what he started with was, okay, so we've known in the historical record that lands were changed as a result of genocide. And he started with a record that was written in the 1500s and then said, okay, now science has affirmed this, right? So these conversations about the past are really about how we begin to narrate ourselves, how we begin to narrate ourselves as a collective, how we begin to think about colonialism and what its legacy is in the present as we think about what the future is. And so I think there's a lot of space there to begin talking about Indigenous knowledge as a completely kind of other way of relating to environment. And because we can go down that road with Indigenous knowledge, you can ask different kinds of questions as well. You can ask questions about stability, for example. If you've been in a lot of science talks like I have around climate change, one of the big areas that people talk about is, the variables that are put into climate models, how we know how things have changed and how much things have changed. But that also prefigures that there was stability at some point, and we're always trying to maintain stability. Well, if you think about Indigenous knowledge, and you think about stories you might know from elders in your own nation or stories you've heard if you're not Indigenous, we talk all the time about change. we actually talk about how to maintain good relations. I think about a story that is from Tahltan Nation. We talk about the ways in which we are in relations with our non-human relatives, and I think about the little things that we do to maintain good relations. For example, when we catch salmon in the Stikine, before we go to put them in the smokehouse, we hang them on these wooden structures. And the salmon that we hang there, we have to make sure that they face upriver, because the salmon who are swimming by need to remember which way to go, right? So it's a very small ritualistic thing, but it shows that we are constantly in relation with our salmon relatives, with the land, and there's an obligation, there's a reciprocity, there's a responsibility there, and a lot of that conversation is missing from the science conversation. And I continually feel like I say that climate change allows us to put a lot more on the table. But Indigenous knowledge has already done a lot of that work for us, actually. And so bringing that into conversation and starting from a basis of relation gets you to a really different set of questions around how do we understand the disruption that occurred with colonialism? How do we understand the ways that humans can get back into good relations? So when I was walking through the exhibit, I was really moved particularly by the video where you're digging. And I'm sorry, I'm talking right to Lisa. But the image of digging, I feel like this is something I'm continually doing in my academic work. That feeling of just trying to bring the past into the present so that it informs how we think going forward. And in my ethnographic work, that's what I hear from communities as well. In my life as a Tahltan person, that's what I hear from our communities as well. The last slide you can switch to. So I started you with the first slide. I didn't explain what that was, but that is an image taken from this summer when I went up to Mount Edzaidza, which is a really important place in Tahltan territory. Mount Edzaidza obsidian, which is what you're looking at right now, has been found all over North America. And obsidian is really important, right, because you can trace what volcano it came from. So it came from our huge so much of the obsidian came from our huge volcanic complex. And the obsidian is really amazing there because it comes in all 5 colors. So you're looking at black obsidian, but you can find red and gray and green, blue. It's beautiful. It's fascinating to have been there this summer when I'm already thinking about the Anthropocene as a concept and thinking about how we begin to tell different kinds of stories even within climate change, even whilst all this activism is going on to recover kind of a relational framework for thinking about the environment.
Well, thank you. Oh, sorry. Oh. Okay, should we?
Good news, everyone. All your finger and leg crossing worked, and Grace has made it. So here she is.
So Dave maybe is, yeah. So I'm going to introduce, I'll let Grace get settled, and I'll. That's okay. Oh, no. So I'll let you get settled, and I'll introduce Dr. Atleo, so you can kind of grab your breath. So Dr. Cliff Atleo is Tsimshian and Nachalnuth, whose research examines Indigenous governance, community development, and political economy. He is interested in how Indigenous communities navigate, /adopt/resist mainstream capitalism while working to sustain their unique cultural identities, practices, and worldviews. His postdoctoral, wait a minute, you're not a postdoc anymore, no. I'll just leave it there, wait a minute. You've moved on from postdocs, so I'll just leave it there. So, thank you, Cliff, Dr. Atleo.
Thanks, June. Okay, so I've been here 3 times, I think, or this is my 3rd time to this building, and every time the irony of the Goldcorp Center for the Arts is not lost on me. And then I reflect upon the scholarships that I've earned over the years. Inspire, I don't know if you know, Inspire is partially funded by Shell, Suncor, Rio Tinto. And so my first commentary coming today, not on Lisa Jackson's work, but coming into the building, was the idea, perhaps contentious, that Indigenous futurisms will be funded by resource extraction. Yeah, I suppose that should probably rankle a few feathers. But like I said, going through my master's and my bachelor and my PhD, I got funded by these organizations. I gladly accepted them as I ate my Mr. Noodles and boiled eggs and, lived the student life. But I think it's certainly an irony that we wrestle with. So my PhD research really looked at the political economy of the Nuu-chah-nulth people, so my father's side. My name is Chacha Mahni from Ahousaht, and on my mother's side, as June mentioned, I'm Tsimshian. I have 2 Tsimshian names, Nisnaya and Gamayam. And the research that I was doing was, it was really motivated by sort of a visceral feeling. So my community in 2002, in March of 2002, were in the local news headlines protesting the introduction of fish farms into our territories. in March 2002. By November 2002, we had signed an impact benefit agreement with those fish farms. And so at the time, as a young, I guess I was youngish worker, working for the Tribal Council, I really wanted to understand this. I was like, how did we come from that, this protest, to the point where we're now one of maybe 2 or 3 Indigenous communities on the whole coast that are actually partnering with fish farms? I really, my research going into my master's and my PhD really wanted to understand that. So to make a long story short, I guess looking at the political economy of our communities, literally from day one, contact with Captain Cook in 1778, where he came into our territory, the Mowichat-Matchelat territory, which is actually our northerly neighbors. And my uncle Umik, Richard Atleo, tells this story in his book that he tells the story about how we became to be known as Nootka people. And he says that when Captain Cook's boat came into Friendly Cove, I think was the area, and he was saying that they were, the Mowichat people were saying, Nookshi, Nookshi, which is, he says, means like, go around, you're going to hit a reef. And he says that Captain Cook thought, oh, they must be saying this territory is called Nootka. So for whatever number of years, to ethnographers and historians, we became known as Nootka people until we reclaimed, or we established our own collective name of Nuu-chah-nulth people. But from that first contact, so Cook stayed in the territory for a month. He had to repair some masts, I believe, so he was trading. He traded for sea otter pelts, which essentially began the maritime fur trade of sea otter pelts going to China. And there was like an immediate impact of change. And there were a couple of scholars at the university, or not university, the Royal BC Museum over in Victoria, Inglis and Haggerty. I don't remember their first name, but they wrote a chapter in a book about Nuu-chah-nulth people saying that all of these historians, and they're talking about at least a dozen historians talking about Nuu-chah-nulth life, you know, from those years, the late 18th century onwards, as depictions of traditional Nuu-chah-nulth life were not necessarily entirely accurate, or at least in the sense that they were presented as this pre-contact traditionalism, if you will. The argument they're making is that at that moment, within that first month, we radically shifted some of our subsistence patterns to feed this new trade relationship. And so one of the things I discovered, so there was that initial contact. There were a number of sort of economies that we participated in over the years. There were a number of sort of colonial economies like commercial whaling, the pelagic seal hunt, that kind of came and went, or they lived for 20 or 30 years and drove various species to near extinction and then shifted elsewhere. And one of the things that I discovered through my research was we experienced over that time tremendous change and tremendous continuity. And the continuity, I think, is the part that gets missed in some respects. You know, we're constantly looking at that pre-contact time, or the courts are saying, you have an Aboriginal right if this was like a pre-contact practice that had somehow survived that time. So the idea of changing continuity was something that definitely stuck with me. And the other thing was this idea of tradition. So tradition in our communities is quite contentious at times. The intergenerational relationship is certainly not what it always was. There's been fractures and disconnections. And then at times, you know, if you're a young Indigenous person, you've probably experienced tradition in some ways as being weaponized against you, like particular traditions, or feeling shame for not knowing certain things or knowing how to say things in a certain way, or certain traditions that have been infused with misogyny or sexism. It's always a very contentious thing. And one of the things that one of my conclusions, if you will, was that tradition is not something that was frozen in time, you know, in 1750 or something like that. Traditions, as they manifest, as we continue to exercise them, must maintain some sort of relevance to the current community, or else they fade away and they no longer become traditions, if you will. So there's this idea of a future traditionalism, or this idea of an ongoing lived thing, not something that is essentialist and from a particular date. So reflecting a little bit on Lisa Jackson's installation, I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to say I'm a political scientist and I find creative things really awesome and really intimidating. And I have no idea if my interpretation is, I don't even know if I can make one. I think the thing that struck me most, the first installation was this sense of, of an immersive, it was almost like a VR experience, the tunnel. And it made me think a little bit about what the future might hold for virtual reality as a way of connecting with our homelands. Obviously, it's not like a substitute completely, but it is you can still evoke emotion, you can still evoke some sort of a visceral reaction, a sense of place. And I think this is a real thing for us. So I think on average in Canada, about 50 to 55% of Indigenous people no longer live in their homelands. In Nuu-Chah-Nulth territory, it's close to 70%. So our community members live in Vancouver and Toronto and Seattle and Victoria and other places. And so I'm curious about what the future of VR might hold in terms of like these immersive 3D sound and visual and tactile experiences might hold as far as some sort of connection to our homelands. The second part of the installation was quite, the things that sort of occurred to me were the darkness, the light at the end, and sort of the light in a way of like, digging for something lost or digging frantically. There was a sense of urgency there. And I don't know, this is where my artistic interpretations are perhaps self-conscious, but I found that that there is this sort of combination of looking back and looking forward, being in the darkness of colonialism and sort of a future brightness, if you will, of our sort of future possibilities. And then with the building, sort of the cityscape, I was thinking of like, I don't know if it was Socrates or Plato and the wall, the sort of the cave. I had this sense of this cityscape, being artificial in a sense, or not necessarily being permanent. Again, I have no idea what I'm talking about. It's just.
No, I think, no, you definitely know what you're talking about.
And then finally, sort of in part 3, again, I got this real sense. So there was a big lineup to get into the dome there, into the tent. And so I had a lot of time to take in, everything around. And I was struck by this sort of desert-like landscape. If you look closely, you could see stumps. You could see, for somebody on the West Coast, I think of like clear cuts. I think for me, and then you had the bright trees of many different colors, the bright young trees that were growing. And in the darkness, it seemed like on the horizon for me, there seemed to be like a pre-dawn time. Like it was just still certainly dark, but you get this sense that lightness was coming at some point. And then, of course, the language. I recognized my friend Kalsilam and part of the language talking, which was really cool. And I certainly appreciated the fact that there was also no translation. I spent years working in my communities and hearing people like my father and other elders speak. My father would speak at like a political meeting, and he would talk in his language for 15 minutes, and then just stop, and people would kind of like. I could pick up what he was saying, like the topics of what he was saying, but not exactly what he was saying. And on the one hand, that there's a certain inaccessibility to that. And on the other hand, I know he was trying to recreate a new normal, or kind of recreate an immersive experience that people, to get used to that, as opposed to completely speaking in English or relying on translation. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Atleo. I think there's an art critic struggling to get out of there. That was really good. It's like, yes, come on, we're more fun. I'm going to go on to Dr. Dave Gertner, and I think it kind of goes really well with Dr. Atleo. As I mentioned, Dr. Dave Gertner is an associate professor and assistant, sorry. Well, I just promoted you. In First Nations and Indigenous Studies at UBC, and he does a lot of work in Indigenous new media. So I think that kind of goes with Dr. Atleo's questions about immersive technology and how, so you talk a lot about landless territory, so, yeah.
Yeah, hi, everybody. I wasn't supposed to be here, so I'll keep my comments short because there's more nuanced perspectives here. And a lot of it, my perspective is also informed out of Grace's work, the person who coined Indigenous futurisms. And so something I've been thinking a lot in terms of what she says. Particularly right now, I'm teaching a course in Indigenous speculative fiction, and I think there's a few students who are here. And we've been trying to think about Indigenous new media and Indigenous fiction within some of the terms that Grace talks about, sort of the detriments of science fiction as a very white genre, as a very colonial genre, that it, in fact, is often premised on the notion of the erasure of Indigenous peoples and peoples of color. So Nalo Hopkinson has a great quote where she talks about, to paraphrase, it's something to the effect of, whenever I read science fiction where there are no people of color, I wonder when the Great Race War happened, and why this author did not feel fit to mention it in their text. So there's a couple of things we've been thinking about in the class as a way to sort of frame speculative futures, and one of them is Eve Tuck's essay called Suspending Damage, where she talks about damage-centered research versus desire-focused research. And she calls for a moratorium on damage-centered research. So this is research that perpetuates a deficit model, that continues this idea of Indigenous peoples as less than or as struggling. And what she sees, there's often a need for this kind of research, that it can be used to levy reparation or redress, that it in fact creates a cycle where she says the effects of that are worse than what we might get out of it. So she calls for the shift to desire-focused research. And this is research that holds up the hopes, the wisdom, and the futures of Indigenous people. And I find it really provocative to think about what speculative fiction means within that framework. So speculative fiction as a genre of desire. And this is sort of to think more critically about science fiction, if it is even possible to decolonize a genre and what that might mean. And so this is something we've been thinking about through the work of Dallas Hunt, who's a friend and colleague now working in the English department at UBC. He's a Cree scholar who's done a lot of great work and has a great critique of Mad Max Fury Road. And he makes this argument that what science fiction, speculative fiction has done is often premised, again, on the erasure of Indigenous peoples. And so he talks specifically about this new genre, speculative fiction, which is almost entirely framed around what is sort of known as cli-fi. Ridiculously as cli-fi. Climate fiction, solar punk. There's another one, water thrillers, they're called, so the disappearance of water. And all these are very white-centered types of fiction, and that are sort of based around this notion of settler colonialism. So this notion of terra nullius and the erasure of Indigenous peoples. And so Hunt applies this really great analysis to Fury Road, which in fact he uses Marjorie Fee's notion of totem transfer novels where in Canadian fiction there's this trope, this long-running trope of white characters leaving the city going to find themselves, meeting an Indigenous character who then physically hands them something, and then the white character takes that, they have found themselves, and then the Indigenous person disappears into the wilderness. So there's this notion, again, of a settler colonial notion of the white person having claim to land, but also claiming indigeneity for themselves. And so against that, Hunt argues for Indigenous fiction, which disrupts that model and locates Indigenous people within future spaces. And I think this is what is particularly potent about Lisa's work, not just in this piece that we've seen today, but also in the VR piece itself as well. And something we're going to be thinking about in relation to Cherie Dimoline's novel, The Marrow Thieves, as well, right? So this is sort of around the question of dystopia for whom, right? If the settler state collapses, who is it dystopic for, and who might it be a scene of resurgence and revitalization for? And how could we reframe what dystopia means and what dystopic fiction means within those spaces? And I think a work like Bitaban, like Transmissions, are about locating Indigenous presence within future spaces, and not even without the consideration of what a settler colonial framework of sci-fi means. And there's the third piece of Transmissions, where you are on that landscape, and you have the dome with that variety of voices in that space. To me, feels like this really, I think, really powerful way that Indigenous spec-fic is pushing those boundaries and actually asking us to think critically about what sci-fi means, what Indigenous futurisms can mean, and what folks like Lisa, like Cherie Dimoline, and a number of other authors. I have a syllabus somewhere that I should be able to think of more names, but again, I wasn't supposed to be here. What are contributing to a reframing of that genre, and I think it's wonderful to see folks here today collectivizing around those ideas and thinking more about those potentials. So thank you very much, and I'm going to let Grace talk now.
Thanks, Dr. Gertner, for stepping in and at the last minute and giving people resources they can look into and just reiterating how important Indigenous speculative fiction is. We're very excited to have Dr. Grace Dillon, who's an Anishinaabe and a professor in the Indigenous Nation Studies program at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon, where she teaches on a range of interests, including Native American Indigenous studies, science fiction, Indigenous cinema, popular culture, race and social justice, and early modern literature. I just want to say, and most importantly, coined the phrase Indigenous futurism. So yes, that's very cool. Among her many publications, she is the editor of Walking the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction from 2012, and Hive of Dreams, contemporary science fiction from the Pacific Northwest, 2003. So welcome. Thank you.
Anin. For those of us like Lisa and I who speak Anishinaabe, Anin in a sense means hello, but the true sense of it is I see the light in you. And I have always loved that meaning, that is the way that one greets each other. Anin, I see the light in you. Now, first of all, I must really, really apologize because through some snafus with plane travel, I have not yet been able to see this wonderful, wonderful exhibition, and I can hardly wait to see it. But just in listening to the little bits of conversation I've heard, there are some things that are reminding me of the way we take care of Mitsukumikwa, or our Mother Earth. I actually have a lot of people back home in Portland that told me, you can't go here because we're all on a climate strike. I don't know if that's been kind of heading around everywhere. And so there was a part of me that felt guilty, and then I thought, wait a minute. I know Lisa Jackson's work, and I know that she works with those kinds of ideas, and that she decolonizes what the Anthropocene has come to mean. And to me, a lot of that is, and this is a huge aspect of Indigenous futurisms, is that we offer hope. We offer hope no matter how much occurs in our life. The kind of continuing of the genocide, not just cultural genocide, but the continuing of genocide that is going on. And I've noticed that for those of us who go through that kind of experience, that maybe we can offer some genuine, realistic hope. It's not fanciful, it's not extravagant, it's not even extrapolative in Robert Heinlein's sense. It is, Helen Haig Brown, when she did her film, The Cave, and she and I were talking about it, and I just love this saying. She didn't really know what science fiction was, and she was in a Lars von Trier experiment and having to kind of get out of her element, you know, which is so wonderful. She does wonderful documentaries. And so she was trying to sort out even what science fiction is, and then how Indigenous futurisms, which, by the way, like Afrofuturism, like Africana futurisms, like Gulf futurisms, like Latinx futurisms, like Asian futurisms. And I say all that because I'm currently editing a Routledge handbook with all of those areas, along with queer futurisms. And we're bringing in CRIP studies as well. And what she said was, oh, after I went into a long rambling explanation, oh, I get it. You just take the fiction out of science fiction. And I have continued to say that because that is so true. The Indigenous futurisms that we write, is it the Moon Rice? Yes, yeah. And that, there is so much of the fiction taken out of that situation. And yet, at the end of that, when I read that story, I have hope. It's something in the way that Octavia Butler and then Andrea Hairston, who is both Cherokee and African, and has written many wonderful, wonderful novels, and I've exchanged things with her. And there's a term that I really, really love that I'm borrowing from Andrea. It's called the impossibility specialist. And I think of Indigenous futurism creators and artists in a way as impossibility specialists, that you take the really large issues, you grab onto what is real. Just as you were saying, Dave, there's so much, and I apologize, I've had almost 24 hours of no sleep, so my apologies. If I start blanking out like a Nokomis, like a grandma. But it's that when we tell our stories, they are true stories, they are centered stories with us. And those stories can come in any form. And what I've noticed is this global, international, and I've been traveling internationally, and there's just this global outburst of indigenous futurisms. And it's done in so many ways. When I was in Hawaii in June for an actual Indigenous Futurisms Conference, if you can believe that. It was put on by the Science Fiction Research Association. I can't tell you how big a move that is. And I should also mention that the way I got a tenure track position in science fiction, that's how I started off. And then I was interested in creating an Indigenous program at our campus, and we were able to do that. And now we're turning into a department. We have Theodore Van Alst, who is our director and chair, doing really wonderful things. But it was Ursula K. Le Guin, if you guys are familiar with her at all. She was actually the one that took me under her wing. We lived in Portland together, and she said, Grace, and she said, I apologize, you're going to be the token Native scholar for a while. And yay, I'm not any longer. Or a scholactivist, which is the way I like to think of it. We share our impossibility specialist projects and stories as scholactivists in a very genuine kind of way. It's very meaningful. One thing that I think is that Indigenous Futurisms has to offer to the field of science fiction is our Indigenous scientific practice, because our conception of science is rooted much more in STEAM than it is in STEM. So STEM as science, engineering, mathematics, right? But STEAM has the art in it. And that is our science. We have always been building tunnels and creating forms of architecture well before the forms of virtual reality. And I'm very excited to see the possibilities of VR and what you can do with that. And I'm guessing this takes many hours. Is that true, Lisa? Are there so many conversations?
There's a lot. Yeah, there's 80 minutes in English and there's about 40 minutes in Indigenous languages.
Woohoo! Now, how often do you get that kind of opportunity? Back at the Indigenous Futurisms Conference in June, in Hawaii, there's all kinds of Indigenous video games and practices with virtual reality. And I want to give huge credit to Jason and Skawanati for going out and really working with them out there. And so we were able to actually see a lot of games that they had worked on. And what was really interesting to me, and also a movie, Waitiki, which is coming out, which is Indigenous Futurist. And so I was there at the screening and helping out a little bit here and there. like we're doing here, right? With the important person is the artist and what has been done and how you feel and how you react to it. And our Gikan and our Atazukanan, our knowledge and even our sacred knowledge becomes all a part of that. And it's Gregory Cajete, who I love so much as an Acoma Pueblo man. He actually, in a recent book, he's always been writing about Native science and doing it. He's always been out in the field actually doing it. And I have to say, for our own family too, we were really energized. We have 27 acres that we are turning into a genuine carbon sink. So we use no mowing, no tractors, we scythe. And then when we get tired of that, we get animals to help kind of clear up the area there. But what he notes is that indigenous science, and I really have to wonder if a lot of the popularity of indigenous futurisms is actually offering a high context look at science. Because really with just, when you're working in just labs, and you can do that too, but when you do that and you have that kind of westernized idea of getting it down to just a particle or so, that becomes a low context kind of experience, right? Now, I'm not dismissing that, by the way. I think that it's important to combine that. We have plenty of biomolecular programs going on at tribal schools, right? We have all kinds of things going on. But the high context is when art is included. And when that art is included, and that's what I had to throw away my sweetgrass when I came in, but I was hoping to smudge before going in. And that's all a part of our science, right? That's ceremony, dance, song, stories. All of that is a part of our science. It's not exempt, it's not separate from our science. And one thing, I have way too many points here, but the other thing that I would say is that in relation to eco-criticism, we have, and I'm going to be using the Bawating dialect, which we're busy trying to write down, but has not been written down, and that's what I grew up with. So forgive me if my Anishinaabewan sounds a little bit different from other tribal areas. But Kina Gichi Nishnabeg Agamig, what that refers to is the idea of an ecology of intimacy. It's an ecology of intimacy. And that is what I think really stands out about Indigenous futurisms. Even when it's a book like, let's see if I have it here. And oh, by the way, I brought this big suitcase filled with tons of books to share. Well, what I will do is just reference it. It's by Alexis Wright, who is Australian Aboriginal, and it's called The Swan Book. Has anyone here had an opportunity to read that yet? It's come out pretty recently, and it's very much what I would say about our ecology of intimacy is we are not just about climate change, and that's where a lot of the cli-fi, and I've read through them in the solar punk and the eco-punk, a lot of times that's where they stop, right? Is they work with climate change. But Indigenous futurisms, and this is just a pattern that I've noticed, even in Louise Erdrich's, The Home of the Living God, right? You know, there's a sense of, oh, sorry. There I go again. Climate justice. That's the word I was looking for. Because we are very, very aware with our areas and our territories being drastically affected. We're not just about teaching or letting people know that climate change exists, which is a sorry state of affairs in the States, I have to tell you. It's getting better. But we're about climate justice because we are self-determined peoples. And the stories that come across that way are those of self-determined peoples. We don't simply just let our home slide into the ocean and do nothing about it, right? We work on maintaining forms of climate justice, and we network with each other, and we help each other out with that. And I was very conscious of that when I was both in Hawaii and even in Germany recently. There's all kinds of receptiveness to indigenous futurism stories, because the exciting part for people that read through it, even as they get into the lives of, because that's the story arc, right? They are also noticing and saying, oh, wow, this is something that we could actually do. And so I'll try to get to my last point here really quickly, if I can find it. Or I may just go ahead and speak as everyone else is. Yes. Okay. We love in our Anishinaabemowin language to really play with many, many, many different levels of meaning. And so one of our words, baguan, refers to drifting. But in a way, it's not just simply drifting. You're drifting to the pace, the direction, and the place on the river or the lake. You're watching the drifting, and you go along with the drifting that's caused by the waves and the wind. And what I would like to suggest is another pattern in Indigenous futurisms that comes up quite often. So I'm very excited about the length of the tunnel. Is that we don't just dip into or have fun with or play around with slow food movements, right? Eating local foods as much as possible. But we actually connect with what Isabelle Stenger, a French philosopher, has talked about in a new book that has come out that I'd highly recommend, where she's actually saying this is what we need to do. And when I read it, I thought, oh, this is what we're doing. But she calls it slow science. That it's time to have in our world a slowing down, and that includes a slow science where we take our time with it. We don't just jump into it. We don't just innovate and then have a pharma company buy it, and turn it into pills. We actually slow down our science and take a look at that. And I'll just end with another word that I think Lisa and I both love, and any other niche here. You're niche too? Oh! I'm married to one. Oh! That's all that matters. But I just want to end with the thought of kobati, which is our word for, it takes a little while. It means embracing each other, but what it is really referring to is the embrace of generations. And I think that that is a huge difference that we have with Indigenous futurisms as well. A lot of the futurisms coming out, because I look at a lot of them, are assuming that it's a younger generation, right, that will come to the rescue somehow. And that is not our thinking. Our thinking is kobate. Our thinking is we are the seventh generation at all times. We embrace and spiral and go back to the 7 generations and of course beyond. we also look forward to the seventh generations that are coming. So in that sense, Kobati is a genuine embracing, and I've seen a lot of images of it as an Ekomas or a grandma embracing her granddaughter. And I think that that is a beautiful, beautiful thought that appears in so many of our Indigenous futurisms. Stories, films, digital projects, TV shows, so much more. Che Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists. I think we're going to open it up to questions, and I just want to so we have about 15 minutes, so please be brief. We don't want comments. I'm sure you're all lovely people, but we don't want your life story. So, so please keep your questions brief. And I don't know if there's a microphone going around.
Can we use one of these?
Yeah, so questions.
Did a hand go up for a question?
Oh, there we go.
Okay, okay.
Sure. You know, the weight of this building, which we kind of discussed like a little bit, when Woodward's was around, this area was, you know, constantly referred to as like, you know, tragic and dangerous, and, you know, and we know that the plan was to get some reputable businesses into this space, and this block was the block that they were going to use to gentrify the rest of the neighborhood. And affectionately, this area was used to be called, like, you know, the Little Res. So the legacy of this building is just so heavy that it almost seems like when talking about the work, you have to start with that. I know we're not supposed to go on, but I went to this amazing symposium here. It was called Digital Debt Empire. It was put on by SFU and the OR. And it was nice to see that right at the beginning, speakers would take the stage and they would say something like, welcome to SFU's ongoing colonial project. So anything you want to do with that, thank you.
Any takers? Well, I don't know. I feel like Dr. Atleo kind of talked about it already, or did you want to expand farther?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's colonialism in many ways is inescapable. The air we breathe is completely of a particular way, and I think for me anyway, in my research is trying to understand how we got to where we are and where we're going. So I research resource management, for example, and I'm interested in First Nations that are opposing the pipeline, and I'm interested in First Nations that are supporting the pipeline, and understanding why, and trying to go beyond this idea that these people are sellouts and these people are not, or these people are traditional and these people are not. Each community is very complex, and how they came to be in a particular place, economically and politically, has a lot to do with settler colonialism. So all I can say is I'm interested in sort of the nuance and the efforts that certain communities and individuals make in the interest of maintaining some sort of continuity through change, as well as autonomy and self-determination.
Yeah, just add to that. I feel like because I work in journalism and I talk to a lot of scientists and I went to a science institution, that I continually remind people we work in a colonial context. And so that, I mean, like that just should be orienting everything that we do. And so to me, this is just to touch back on Lisa Jackson's work. I think this is really what's beautiful is when you walk into the tunnel, you know, the bifurcation of the images, it really reminds you that there was a past, there is a future. What are we in now? We continually walk this, and bi probably is not the right, multifurcated, like the multiples that we are constantly envisioning. I think it's really reflected in her work.
Okay, I'll tell you a colonial project. My daughter, Elizabeth LaPensée, has a video game called Thunderbird Strike, and she made it available. It was very important to her. All of her games she makes available for free. Even though there's a lot of money put into it, it's very important to her to have public access. And it was referencing the snake, the black snake. And the game is that you can destroy parts of that black snake, and then you can choose to refurbish Mitsukumikwa with plant persons, animal persons, all different kinds of things, right? Well, sure enough, there was a senator or someone running to become senator in Minnesota who got wind of this and made it his campaign platform, indigenous eco-terrorism. And this actually went to and is still in the House of Representatives. Thank goodness we have Democrat, so they're kind of leaving it aside. But they actually, oh dear, the pretender Trumpist is the way I think of him. When he was trying to go after video games for all of our shootings that have been going on, all of the mass shootings, and he tried to suddenly blame it on that. The colonial project of this was that she was the only one listed. There are so many other games out there that would qualify. But no, you know, they went after a very small, 2D game that's free and available to all. And so that, I think, is a moment of a genuine colonial project.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Oh, I saw a hand. Oh, maybe two, maybe two, maybe two. Can we?
There's been a lot of, wow, that's weird. There's been a lot of discussion of indigenous science fiction media and the rise in popularity of that. And my question is, do you think, or is it a concern that if it gets more popular, some of the ideas and themes of it might be sanitized and gentrified for like settler entertainment and media?
Just quickly, I'll reference Paul Delaney, not Paul Delaney, Samuel Delaney, who writes about racism in science fiction. Paul Delaney is a professor at SFU. But he talks about the economic constraints of spec fic that comes from the periphery. And the fact that when the market is weak, that it actually creates more space for that kind of gentrification that you're speaking to. And because authors are compelled to write stuff that isn't going to get them in trouble, like happened to Beth, right? They need to get paid, so they are more likely to tone down. I know Beth doesn't stop. That is it's amazing the work that she does. So I think right now, actually, we are seeing a point in time in the publishing industry where we have money coming in, and we see authors who are going and actually pushing the boundaries further. And I think symposia like this, support of these texts in our classrooms, is going to lead to more progressive work that challenges the boundaries, and work that takes it further. So I am opposed to the notion that we have to be concerned about the gentrification, the settler recuperation of this work, because I think that does not lend to the sophistication of the authors, the creators who are making this kind of stuff.
Okay, so did you want to? Okay, did you want to?
I actually really agree with Dave. I mean, this is an area that we're really, really excited about. And I'm going to give away that there's a film coming out, Antlers, by Guillermo del Toro and Scott Cooper. And I was the Anishinaabe consultant for that. That's all I'm going to say. And what was fascinating is, in the moment where you would think there was some gentrification, Scott himself as a director, he sent me his script and said, cut it up, splice it up, do anything that you want with it. So I wrote back 16 pages of straight, not double, commentary. And he did every single one. And so, you know, I may be too idealistic, but what I'm seeing is a real excitement. The series Clever Men, for instance, in Australia, on Netflix, there's been all kinds of accolades about that. So I agree with David that the people I'm seeing are really excited, really pushing the boundaries. And we do have an Imagining Indigenous Futurisms contest that, if you go to Imagining Indigenous Futurisms on Facebook, that's offered as $1,000 for stories, and we're going to compile that into, actually it's going to be several anthologies, because there were so many good entries over the 10 years. And I tell you, the judges that I've had looking it over, blown away by the radical experimentation that's going on. So yes, we'll see, but at this point, it's just very exciting. Seeing Lisa Jackson's former work too, that I just love, is part of that. The feeling you make for me, Lisa, is the idea of we are dancing together. That's always the sensation that I get with any of your projects that I've seen, is that we are, you know, there's no I in it. There's a we, and we are dancing together.
I think that's a great way to leave the panel. Again, thanks to our panelists. Bring them around.